Hi friends, welcome to Houseplant Tips and Tricks. My name is Nick and today I'm going to discuss some winter plant care basics. This series is sponsored by repotme.com. Get all of your indoor gardening supplies delivered to your door from one place. Repotme.com has practically everything you need for your orchids, succulents, and houseplants, including handmade potting mixes, planters, fertilizers, and much more. If I had my way, it would be spring or fall year-round. It's just so cozy. But winter's on its way and there's nothing I can do about it. So there's a couple of things I'm gonna have to keep in mind going forward in these darker, colder months to keep my plants as happy as can be. The most obvious thing about wintertime is that it's pretty cold, depending on where you live, of course. And it goes without saying that tropical plants aren't too fond of the cold. Most houseplants are going to suffer if they're exposed to temperatures around 50 degrees Fahrenheit or lower for extended periods of time. But there are some plants, like Gesneriads, for example, that will show signs of poor health in temperatures even just around 60 degrees Fahrenheit. As the days get darker and the weather gets cooler, I would recommend assessing your windows. You'll be able to tell pretty quickly if you're dealing with drafty windows, which of course is going to be detrimental to your plant's health. The windows in my home are decently drafty, so I do have to practice caution with the plants I'm going to be placing around there in the wintertime. More succulent plants like snake plants, Hoyas, cacti, succulents, they are going to handle that cold weather much better than a lot of other plants would. Leafier plants, for example, not so much. For these more finicky plants, I would just recommend moving them away from the windows in the meantime until the spring when things start to warm back up. When pulling them from the windows, you might be concerned that you're not going to give them as much light as they typically require. Fortunately, most plants are dormant in the wintertime, so they are not going to be actively growing, so that's really not a major concern that you should have. You can absolutely use grow lights to supplement your plants with some extra lighting, just because they won't be actively growing. It's not 100% necessary unless you're crowding all of your plants in a warm room in the house or the basement where maybe there's no light or not very much light. Then grow lights are 1000% necessary. There are countless options of grow lights that you can use in the home. There's really no wrong answers. Repotme.com does have a couple great options available though, so I will be sure to leave those linked in my description below. If you click on any of those links and you make a purchase, I will earn some commission, so thank you in advance. A fantastic way to treat yourself while supporting a creator. And you can use code NICK to save 10% on any potting mix from repotme.com. A big conundrum, possibly the biggest conundrum of all that we're going to deal with in the wintertime, is the heat. Running the heater dries out the home like no other. Using a humidifier is a fantastic way to combat this. However, I know some people, including myself, don't want to have a humidifier running in their home 24/7. I just don't want to be living in a wet, sticky space. I spend the majority of my time here. I'm not doing that. My favorite way to increase humidity for my plants without actually increasing the humidity of my physical space is by using glass enclosures. You can use things as small as like tiny glass closures. I have those all over my home with just a singular plant inside and just call it a day. It practically takes care of itself and you only have to go inside and water them way less than you water the regular plants that are just sitting out in the open. Because of that controlled humidity, it just works wonders on keeping your plants hydrated without causing them to rot. I don't really know the science behind it, but it works. Terrariums are also a fantastic way to display a couple plants or maybe even just one small plant in an area where it can be treated more like a piece of art or a focal point. You could even go all out and use like a larger vivarium, or the ever so popular greenhouse cabinets are another fantastic way to keep a lot of plants happy at once in a controlled environment. I find the greenhouse cabinets to be like the most foolproof way to grow houseplants successfully throughout the entire winter. They do require a little bit more installation than just simply placing a piece of glass over a plant and calling it a day. However, the trade-off is that instead of just one plant, you're able to keep a bunch of plants happy. I do use grow lights inside my greenhouse cabinet. It's decently dark in there, and I don't just use it for winter plant care. I'm using it for year-round plant care for some plants that prefer some higher humidity. It's just really serving its purpose now that my drafty windows are a drafty and I've had to move a couple of my plants over from there into a space that's going to provide them with the best health possible. I also use humidity trays inside instead of like wiring up a tiny little mini humidifier or something. It's not for me. The trays are from repotme.com. I will leave them linked in my description below as well. And I just place them in the bottom of my greenhouse cabinet and I keep them filled up with water, or I'll just water my plants and let them drip down there, whatever I'm feeling on that day. And that water sitting inside the tray is going to control the humidity inside my greenhouse cabinet and keep that humidity up as high as I need it. I do really enjoy the humidity trays. I use them prior to the greenhouse cabinet when I had my open glass shelf system, and I would just keep a couple humidity trays on there with a couple finicky plants sitting on top of it with, of course, water inside the humidity tray, and that would help keep those finicky plants in a situation that's a little bit higher humidity. It's not going to raise the humidity of the entire room, and that's what I'm looking for. It's just going to keep this space right around it or right above the water that's constantly evaporating in a higher humidity condition. If you have like 600 plants and your home is dry as a desert, you're probably going to require a humidifier, but I do find that the humidity trays work so much better for what I'm looking for. Lastly, let's discuss some overall plant care for the wintertime. As I mentioned, most, but not all, plants are going to be dormant in the wintertime, meaning they're not going to be actively growing. And because of this, we're going to be adjusting the ways that we care for our plants in comparison to the way we care for them in the growing season. We can water our plants drastically less in the wintertime, probably watering most of our plants like every 2 weeks, when typically in the growing season, we'd probably be watering most of them like once a week. However, because of the heat drying out the air immensely, and depending on what your climate is, what your weather is like outside, how high you have the heater in your home, so many factors, there are some times where I found myself in the wintertime watering my plants more often than I did in the summertime. It's probably everything to do with the dry air and perhaps the soil you're using, how old the soil is, how quickly it dries out. Even the planter material, like this unglazed ceramic right here, is going to dry out much faster than these glazed ceramics. So like I said, so many factors having to do with the weather or your actual plants themselves. Just don't be surprised if you find there's a couple plants that are just drying out so fast and you just can't keep up with it when normally they'd be totally fine in the summertime. I've been there. Regardless, the general rule of thumb is to back off with watering and fertilizing in the off season. Fertilizing, you're not even gonna wanna fertilize your plants whatsoever in the winter months. Fertilizing your plants is only for the growing season. Between like April to maybe October, you're gonna go ahead and give your plants the last fertilization for the year to prepare it for the winter time when they're sleeping. There's even some plants, particularly cacti, that are not going to want a single drop of water throughout the winter months. If it's your first winter caring for a plant, I might just recommend doing a little extra research on your plant to double check their care needs. Always better safe than sorry. And if you're a seasoned veteran, I'm sure you've learned from or are learning constantly from the mistakes that you've made in the past. But I think that's gonna do it for today's episode of Houseplant Tips and Tricks, all the winter care basics that you need to know. As I mentioned, I will leave any of the products that I talked about from repotme.com linked to my description below. And don't forget, you can use code NICK to save 10% on any potting mix from repotme.com. Thanks so much for joining me, and thank you to repotme.com for sponsoring this series as always. Always a pleasure. If you don't already, you can follow me on Instagram and TikTok at phillyfoliage. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Come on, what are you waiting for? And I will see you guys in my next video. Have a great day.